In our last 3 episodes, we've looked at the life of Dick Nunis, a key figure in the evolution of the Disney parks. As we've explored in an earlier series, Nunis was essential to the completion of Walt Disney World and opening that project on time. On the Disney World construction site, he saw himself as the extension, in terms of authority, of the California studio, a person who remained on property during those final months, while other executives shifted back and forth from Burbank to Orlando. A large part of the success of the opening of Disney World can be attributed to him. But in our series here, we've been following Nunis through his early years, from his modest beginning to his tragic experience on the USC football team to a summer job at a new amusement park in Anaheim that was slowly becoming, for him, a career. By the time the Matterhorn, the monorail, and submarine voyage opened in 1959, Disneyland was finally a successful operation, one where managers didn't need to wonder if the park actually had enough money in its bank account to cover the paychecks. And as the park found success, Nunis began to look for ways that his role at Disneyland might expand. And that is where we pick up the story today. Though Nunis was rising in importance at Disneyland, he was not necessarily rising in importance in the overall Disney organization, at least not yet. Days after the Matterhorn, the monorail, and the submarine voyage opened, Walt boarded a plane to spend time in West Palm Beach, Florida, where he explored the possibility of building a new theme park then called Project West after West Palm Beach. The code name, purposely confusing, would lead anyone overhearing the conversation to believe that the project was on the West Coast. Design plans were largely overseen by wed artist Bill Martin, one of the original Disneyland area art directors. The goal was to integrate a new Disney park into a resort area and city large enough for 40,000 residents that would be built by millionaire John D. MacArthur. Quote, "Walt selected me for this," Martin explained, "because of the work I had done on the Autopias, doing all that mismatch of highways." The integration of roadways, pedestrian ways, and tourist areas was similar, at least in Walt's mind, to what needed to be accomplished in South Florida. After 2 years of gradual development, these plans fell apart because the Disney team couldn't reach a deal with MacArthur's team on how to share profits for hotels that would be included in the overall project. When asked much later in his life about the Palm Beach Gardens project, Nunis explained, quote, "Palm Beach, to my knowledge, was never on the radar screen." Even with the success of the Matterhorn, Nunis was not yet included in discussions of the overall Disney vision. Instead, he was focused on the management of Disneyland. In the early 1960s, the most important job at the California park was Director of Operations, the executive who oversaw the day-to-day management of the park. In 1960, the director was Doc Lamont, a man who had been with Disneyland since 1954. But in January 1961, Lamont was offered a new position along with a sizable raise to oversee the Cedar Point amusement park in Ohio. Before leaving Disneyland, he called Nunis into his office. He knew that Nunis had been with the park for nearly 6 years, that he'd worked hard and was ambitious. Anyone could see that Nunis wanted to be promoted. Lamont talked with Nunis about his good qualities, then took in a breath and allowed his eyes to fall with reservation on the young man across from him. Nunis sensed what was coming, the disappointment that would be wedged into the next sentence. "I'm not recommending you for my replacement," Lamont said. He was offering Nunis this piece of information, Lamont explained, so that he wouldn't be disappointed when an official announcement was made by Walt. "I know that, Doc," Nunis said. "I'm too damn young." In the days that followed, as Lamont packed up his office, Walt reviewed his options for a new director of operations. There were at least two men, based on their age and experience, who were likely choices: Ed Ettinger, the head of marketing and promotion, and Jack Sayers, who had briefly overseen the park after C.V. Wood's departure, but was now the director of customer relations. Both of these men, far closer to Walt's age than Nunis's, were the Disneyland managers that Walt tended to include in discussions about expansions outside of Anaheim. Walt had included them in discussions about regional parks he considered opening outside of Southern California. He had included them in discussions about an exposition area that he had once considered for a section of Disneyland's massive parking lot. It's likely that Walt wanted to save Sayers and Ettinger for other expansion projects without tying them to a job that would require them to be at the park nearly every day. After considering his options, on January 23rd, Walt concluded that, despite his age, he would promote Nunis. The difference between the two men was striking. Doc Lamont was in his 40s. Nunis was in his 20s. Lamont had managerial experience outside of Disneyland. Nunis was trained and promoted quickly at the park, having worked previously as an apprentice teacher. Outside of Friday night festivities, Lamont was soft-spoken. Nunis was not. Quote, "I was just a kid, and here I was director of operations," Nunis said. Even Nunis sensed that this new role would be a stretch for him. Quote, "I was not ready for that job at all," he said. There were, however, factors that helped Nunis into this position. He was older, if only by a few years, than most Disneyland employees. He had a college degree and some experience in grad school. He had been an effective conduit through which Walt had implemented his wishes at the park, and by using the skills of coaching, he'd developed a firm leadership role in the divisions he'd overseen. The promotion, which took effect on February 1st, placed Nunis as the most senior manager at the park. It also placed him on the planning team for the park's expansion. That is, though he wasn't a ride designer or art director, he offered input as to how best design new attractions so they would work well from the standpoint of the operations team. In the months that followed, cast members began to see Nunis as, quote, "the most imposing figure at the park." As Bob Penfield recalled, quote, "Nunis usually got his way, and you were either one of his guys or you suffered." Jim Cora explained, quote, "He was just a tough guy, and if that was your style, he was a pretty good motivator." Bill Holscher called him Large Richard, though not to his face. Again, in terms familiar to Nunis, at the park, he was now the head coach, the one who urged hosts and hostesses to higher levels of performance. Nunis would define the direction in which the Disney employees together would move, and just like in football, if you disagreed with the play that was called, you'd be taken off the field. The park in 1961 was different than it had been in the 1950s. It had traditions, such as the yearly Christmas party. It had a division that organized the bowling league and baseball teams. It had managers who had worked at the park for years, many since the park's opening. Most importantly, it offered employees a sense of security. No one worried that the park would now close due to poor attendance. Nor did they worry that Disneyland Incorporated wouldn't have enough money to cover payroll. From his new vantage point, Nunis saw with greater clarity how the overall Disney organization was arranged. It was, in essence, three separate companies. There was Walt Disney Productions, which oversaw film and TV content along with related products such as books and records. There was WED Enterprises, Walt's privately owned design and development firm, which created attractions for Disneyland and other venues, such as the upcoming World's Fair in New York. And lastly, there was Disneyland Incorporated, which for the previous 5 years had been its own entity, partially owned by Walt Disney Productions ABC Paramount, Western Publishing, and Walt Disney himself. Nunis understood that creative activity began at both the studio, with films and TV production, and at WED, with attractions and land design, which led to exhibit areas and rides being created for Disneyland. It was a one-way street. Projects moved from the studio and WED to the park, with little input from park operations. Now that he was director, Nunis wanted to reconfigure Disneyland's relationship to those other companies, specifically so the operations team had a larger seat at the planning table. The park would likely never create meaningful projects that would be absorbed into WED or the studio, but Nunis believed that operations people, such as himself, could be far better integrated into planning meetings for how the park developed. As Nunis saw himself as a Disneyland manager with a future, he began to think of planning in longer stretches of time than had earlier park leaders. In Disneyland's first 6 years, 3 people had held the top spot: C.B. Wood, Jack Sayers, and Doc Lamont. As they were all short-timers open to other jobs inside or outside of Disneyland, they had mostly focused on how to best improve the park and staff for the upcoming summer season. Nunis wanted to look beyond that, to engage a planning document that would chart out how the park would develop and expand over a far larger timeline, though he would need to coordinate this with WED and the studio, 2 divisions that looked at themselves as more important than park operations. But then, in the fall of 1961, his role within the overall organization began to change. For years, Walt Disney had battled with executives at ABC over the type of stories he should develop for his Sunday night TV show. ABC wanted more westerns, such as Zorro, while Walt wanted a range of family narratives, including documentaries. The end result was that Walt would part ways with ABC. The weekly Disney TV show would shift to NBC, where it would be aired in color, and Walt Disney Productions would buy out ABC's partial ownership of Disneyland, unifying the park with the studio. In terms of classification, Nunis might now find himself on more equal footing with managers at the studio, with his role better integrated into the power structure of the larger Disney company. Mostly on his own, Nunis developed a 10-year plan, something that far exceeded the vision of previous park directors. A more seasoned manager might have solicited cooperation with a few key WED designers to create consensus and to build support for his proposal before it was presented. But Nunis arranged his materials from within the offices of operations. He charted out attendance, revenues, hiring trends, and proposed areas of expansion. Though he still needed buy-in from designers, he believed that he was now in a position to guide the park forward. Quote, "In the early 60s, Nunis explained, when I was fighting to expand Disneyland, we had a meeting at the Disney Imagineers organization, and I was in the big room, presenting the first continuing 10-year master plan for Disneyland, and Walt was cutting me to pieces." Around the table sat key designers, nearly all of them, from Dick Irvine to Herb Ryman to Harper Goff, were 20 years older than him, old enough to be his father. Some of them looked at Nunis as an interloper presenting a schedule and timeline for work they felt they should oversee. The presentation went poorly, with some dismissing Nunis's plan. Even Walt questioned parts of it. Quote, "I was just about bleeding, and Walt walked out of the room while I was still saying, 'But Walt!' Everybody left the room, and I was sitting in the big room all by myself. I'll never forget it." Nunis looked at his charts, pinned to the wall, charts that he'd created with confidence. After his presentation had been dismissed, he figured he was on his way to being fired. But then the door opened. He looked up and saw the big boss. "Look, young fellow," Walt said, "I'm not always going to agree with you, but you keep expressing your opinions. I like it." In that moment, multiple lessons were presented to Nunis. Perhaps the largest was this: that his youthful confidence still exceeded his abilities and insight, especially outside of the realm of Disneyland. But there was another lesson here as well, which Nunis himself expressed in the following way, quote, "If you're honest and sincere, and believe and think you know what you're talking about, then have the guts to fight for it." A third lesson, perhaps one that Nunis didn't fully appreciate at the time, concerned the power structure inside the Disney organization. Walt believed that the creative people at WED, with their experience as art directors, set designers, and in architecture, still should hold more power over park planning than did managers in operations. And there was one more element in play here, one that at the time was lost on Nunis. As one WED manager put it, Walt believed that, quote, "the tensions between the passion and creativity of the designers and the experience and know-how of the operators was healthy in working to achieve the best Disney product for the public." That is, Walt recognized that new ideas and constraints rising up out of operations would force his designers to reevaluate how they designed attractions for the park, even if this tension didn't reorganize the power hierarchy that existed between those who worked at WED and those who worked at the park. For Nunis, the presentation was a misstep, but one that he learned from. Over the next 2 years, as Nunis spent time with Walt, he continued to learn lessons about perseverance and dedication. Nunis liked Walt. Nunis believed that Walt had a unique way of looking at the world, ideas that would help him grow as a manager. Nunis also respected Walt. Walt was one of the few people, along with Roy Disney, to which Nunis would defer. Though Nunis's gut instinct was to push more vigorously for an equal space at the planning table alongside Dick Irvine and other planners, he accepted Walt's decision that, at least for now, WED should have more power in terms of planning than operations. If Nunis was a type of head coach at the park, Nunis begrudgingly accepted that Walt was the head coach over the entire operation. Just as a player on the football field should accept the current strategy of the head coach, Nunis knew that he needed to accept the organizational strategy supported by Walt, even if he disagreed with it. Their relationship was familiar, strong, based on easily definable roles, yet at times it was complicated. Nunis wasn't simply an extension of Walt's authority in the park. He was a person who provided limited feedback in terms of how the park developed and even how Walt related to the people who worked there. For years, Nunis had been bothered by Walt smoking in public areas, particularly on Main Street, where it wasn't allowed even when the park was closed. Nearly every time Nunis reprimanded a park employee for sneaking a cigarette outside of the break area, that employee pointed out that Walt smoked in the park. The smarter ones added, "Shouldn't we look to Walt as an example?" One afternoon, while walking through the park, Nunis brought up the issue with Walt. "Well, Walt, sir, I know you like to smoke, sir, but I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't smoke in the park." "Well, Dick," he began. "Sir, we don't let our people smoke in costume inside the park. We fire people for that." "Well, Dick, you can't fire me." "No, sir, I'm not going to. I think it would really help me if you didn't smoke." Walt didn't say anything more about it, but on subsequent visits, Nunis observed that Walt only, or perhaps mostly, smoked in his apartment above the Main Street firehouse and in other areas that were technically offstage. For Nunis, one of the largest lessons about the park concerned its role in American culture. This lesson was delivered to him as the park hosted the Reverend Billy Graham, an international celebrity and religious figure. For this visit, Walt personally escorted Graham through the park, pointing out how various themed areas were constructed. Quote, "They went down Main Street," Nunis said. "Billy Graham had never been there." Then they went to Frontierland and Adventureland. After they stepped off a ride and were back in a crowd, Graham said, "Walt, What a marvelous world of fantasy you've created." Walt looked over at the evangelist. "Take a look around," he said. "Look at all the people representing all nationalities, all colors, all languages, and they're all smiling, all having fun together. Billy, this is the real world. The fantasy is outside." Nunis understood Walt's point immediately. For Walt, the park wasn't simply a diversion. It was the beginning of a model society. The idea was, in ways, a simple one. Remove people from their home environments, mix them together in a park where no one has a meaningful advantage. Everyone waits in the same lines, and you can create a type of equality. Disneyland-style entertainment, as Walt understood it, was a means to unify racially, religiously, and economically diverse people, even if that unity only lasted for an afternoon. But if Walt was by nature a visionary and a dreamer, Nunis was by nature a manager, one who was both firm but compassionate. The men under him both feared and respected him. Nunis knew that Walt wanted Disneyland managers to better understand the park, to see it as guests saw it. This was one of the ways that he transformed his staff, even at times it was done roughly. Quote, "Dick would come into offices and see people," one supervisor recalled, "and he'd blow up. 'Get the hell out in the field,' he'd holler." The managers knew what he wanted, to engage and observe guests directly in the park hour by hour. But they also recognized something else in his directions: the echo of sports teams. Even a decade after his neck injury, he was still using the language of football to describe elements of his job. Disneyland wasn't the park. It wasn't a showbiz term such as the stage. For him, it was the field. A place where his players battled against the invisible enemy of public perception and guest satisfaction. Most importantly, they battled so their division would receive approval from Walt. It was this last item, Nunis's desire to elevate the standing of operations, for which many of his supervisors admired him, even if they disliked his gruffness. He was firm in his direction, insistent that his people follow park procedures. Quote, "If you did something wrong," Bill Sullivan explained, "you got your butt chewed, and it got chewed good, but you didn't do it twice." Another park supervisor suggested that Nunis often erred on the side of conservatism, looking to paint the outside world with the moral tones of Disney films. By this time, park employees had their own after-work hangouts arranged by their roles at Disneyland. Executives gathered at Lancers, supervisors at Adamos, and hourlies at either the Camel's Den or the Clock Drive-In. All of these were located either on or very close to Harbor Boulevard. Bob Penfield, a park supervisor, liked to play poker for money at a local bar with hourly cast members. Quote, "One day," Penfield recalled, "Dick Nunis called me into his office. He said that almost every night when he headed home, he saw my red Corvair in the bar's parking lot, and he didn't think it was a good idea for supervisors to be there so often. Disappointed, I realized I had to make a change, and started parking my car across the street." But his gruffness was tempered by a quiet generosity. For years, Nunis was the captain or co-captain of the United Fund Drive at the park. He also took a deep interest in the people who worked for him, particularly his supervisors. Quote, "Dick had a hard shell on the outside," Bill Sullivan explained, "but he has a heart as big as your body. When my wife and I lost our second baby, on his own, he went around to every director, every president out there, and he collected about $175 for me. He walked up to me one day, handed it to me, and walked away. Man, $175 back then was a lot of money." Nunis was not an easy person to define. He was a chorus of wide-ranging, sometimes opposing motivations, though ambition to succeed was near the top of this list. For Nunis, the end goal for his firm management style was a better-trained crew. Jim Cora, a new manager, recalled one morning when he checked his area before park opening, quote, I was opening up Adventureland and Frontierland, and I walked by the French market, and I noticed that all the chairs were stacked on top of the tables. I didn't do anything because I was an operations guy, not a food guy. Dick was out there and says, "Cora, you just walked by French Market. Didn't you see all those chairs stacked on the tables?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you do something about it?" I said, "It's not my job." And he said, "Everything you can see is your responsibility. If you can see it, then you got to take care of it." In this, Cora noted a unique tone of ownership and how the park was laid out. Quote, "That's how he felt," he continued. "It was his park, and by God, everybody there should take care of it." Another park manager in public relations, Frank Forsythe, saw Nunis as a man of power and control, also as a man with an unpredictable personality. When he saw Nunis in the park, Forsythe, quote, "didn't know whether he was gonna hit me or shake my hand." This sentiment was echoed by early Disneyland hire Bill Holscher when he explained half-jokingly that Nunis functioned under the managerial code, the law of the jungle, meaning that he wanted to be the toughest, strongest, and most engaged manager, someone in control of the space around him, someone who used that control to improve the quality of the park. By the early 1960s, Nunis was extremely comfortable inside the berm, in this world of fantasy and adventure where he managed people and directed operations. On rainy days when attendance waned, he gathered his managers for impromptu training sessions. Quote, "Dick would give classes to all of us on the union contract," Jim Cora explained, "so we'd know what we needed to do. He was a team builder. He pulled people together." As Nunis had spent endless hours inside the park, he easily saw into practical aspects of proposed attractions. While Wynn was developing plans for a walk-through exhibit about pirates, Nunis listed out the likely problems for this attraction. By this point, Disneyland had recently opened 2 walk-through attractions, the Sleeping Beauty exhibit on the second floor of the castle and the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse in Adventureland. Nunis could see far better than designers the limitations of a new walk-through attraction based on his experience with the ones that already existed at the park. Walk-throughs were quiet diversions, not centerpiece activities. No families planned a trip to Disneyland because there was a new walk-through. In a memo, Nunis told Joe Fowler, head of Disneyland's construction unit, that, quote, "walk-through attractions have low appeal." When the exchange with Fowler didn't produce a change in design, Nunis looked to Walt. Quote, "Nunis was always on Walt's back for more capacity," WED manager Dick Irvine recalled. Even while New Orleans Square was being framed in with steel, Nunis pointed out the shortcomings of a walk-through exhibit. Quote, "Walt finally weakened," Irvine explained, "and we made a ride-through out of the Pirates exhibit." Though Nunis sometimes was able to persuade Walt to see the park from his point of view as a system focused on guest management and guest satisfaction, he was not always successful when he presented the park as a series of capacity equations or graphs demonstrating the level of guest engagement. He'd come to realize that negotiations with Walt were a slow dance, ideas that unfolded over time, as had happened with the Matterhorn. By nature, Nunis was persistent, but he'd learned that with Walt, congeniality often proved more effective than stubbornness. Quote, "When you're playing with Walt," Nunis explained, "never go for the third strike. You can go after him once, go after him twice, but never go after him 3 times. By this point, Nunis knew how to work with Walt. Nunis admired Walt and his abilities, and Walt, who was good at separating the yes men from those with a genuine interest, responded well to Nunis. They worked as a type of mentor and apprentice, as lead coach and assistant coach. During these years, as the director of operations, Nunis was brought deeply into the Disney organization. He had regular conversations with Roy O. Disney, as well as rising executives Card Walker and Don Tatum. Most executives at the studio knew that Nunis was rough around the edges, but he cared about the company and was able to manage large projects. This growing connection between Nunis and studio executives, including Walt, was not lost on managers at the park. They knew why Nunis was finding this role, also why he was being taken under Walt's wing. Quote, "Because Dick got things done for him," Bill Sullivan explained. "Walt used Dick and used him well, trained him well, and promoted him well. If Walt wanted it, it was done." Nunis was satisfied with this role as well, even if he needed to check some of his competitiveness with WED. He was the long-reaching hand of Walt Disney, who managed the park in Anaheim. But even then, around the studio, most people knew that Walt was looking to expand his efforts in new directions, projects that would not only reshape Nunis' role within the company, but also sharpen the conflict between Nunis' operations team and the designers at WED. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.